Cella System, City of Artray, mid-2670. First, Lieutenant O'Brien, 4th ODR Battalion, Raptor Company. "Engage! Engage!" commanded O'Brien over the company's connected voice input system. The raiders from within the armored personnel carriers exited, using the rhinos as mobile cover. Several raiders made precision shots toward the enemy, missing their mark at times, but ultimately forcing the enemy to keep their own heads down. The steady thumps of the rhino were then sounded, with its rounds strafing along a ridge of Celian emplacements and cover. "Get the Pumas and flank the enemy! Rhino! Keep hitting them and move forward!" "Aye, sir," sounded the ordered parties. The Puma teams were the first to enact their orders, speeding off towards the outer edges of the enemy encampment. The chain guns of the Pumas peppered the shoddily made barriers, kicking up dust and debris as they landed. The Rhino, on the other hand, sustained precision bursts of fire at notable defenses. Thump, 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 thump. A 4-shot burst was sounded from the APC, landing one into the body of a running Celian and the other 3 into a manned turret. Hollers from the raiders were sounded when it was confirmed that a Rhino landed a hit against the enemy equipment. "Yeah, how you like that?" Raptor Company slowly advanced on the enemy position as the Rhinos provided cover and covering fire. When they were close, they then switched to the .50 caliber, and the slow thumps turned into rapid cracks in the air. The Pumas kept on the move, firing into the exposed flanks of the enemy outpost. Screams of pain could be heard as the group approached the encampment. O'Brien halted the Rhinos and, in turn, the rest of his troops. "Rhinos, keep an eye on the buildings and make sure there are no surprises," O'Brien commanded from the cover of the Rhino. He turned to the rear of the group toward a position much farther than where they were situated. It was the Grizzly MBT, both sitting jet behind the crest of a hill overseeing the rest of Raptor Company. "You got eyes on our position?" "Yes, sir. Not seeing anything on thermals. AO looks clear." O'Brien nodded at the report and turned to his squad leaders, motioning for them to advance. They did so, their weapons drawn in an alert posture. They slowly crested the small mound of sandbags and dirt. With a glance, their eyes followed over the mound, first to the area before the hastily made cover. They did so in a manner that reduced multiple points of exposure, so that they only needed to focus on what was before them without worrying about an exposed area they couldn't see or react to if needed. When the first area was cleared, O'Brien quickly popped his torso out from the crest of the mound and readied his weapon, as did others to his left and right. The area right below him was dug deeper than the surrounding ground, a trench. Simultaneously, as he cleared the person-made feature, he also recognized the immediate danger of the surviving enemy force. "Contacts!" he shouted, firing 2 muffled shots into the nearest Celian and 3 into the next. His soldiers beside him expertly followed, doing the same. The body language of the enemy was that of shock, since he couldn't see their faces. Of the 2 he neutralized, the first was holding the second, who was clearly wounded. O'Brien knew they weren't armed, but still fired. Like the strings cut from a marionette, they fell limp into the dirt. As he scanned his surroundings, affirmations from his company were sounded, acknowledging the clearing of the trench. "Clear! X-rays down! All clear!" The route that Raptor Company occupied took place on a main road into the city, through the outskirts of the city. From a distance, the city looked like a continuous metropolis of buildings, rail cars, and roads. However, as they approached the outskirts, they noticed that many of the smaller buildings were spaced at differing intervals with no real structure to their placement. However, as Raptor Company advanced through the streets, O'Brien, from a distance, was met with the realization that the central city was surrounded by a large wall, and their main access route was now obstructed by large, sealed doors. "Walls? I didn't hear anything about walls," voiced Dare. "Yeah, neither did I," replied O'Brien. "Athena, what can you tell me about these walls? Defenses, access routes, all of it?" "Understood," replied the disembodied voice. "It appears there is still power running through the wall, but I will need access to a service terminal for a more definitive answer." O'Brien nodded to the report and turned to his troops that were standing at the ready, eager for his orders. "Listen up, Raptors," sounded O'Brien. "Bravo and Charlie squads, secure a perimeter around the Rhinos and advanced. follow the road to the main gate and hold until my squad secures those doors. Delta, hang back until the Grizzlies can regroup. Any questions? O'Brien waited for a hand from the rear, but it never came. Very well. You have your orders. Move out. Alpha Squad, we're taking the Pumas. Those not part of Alpha Squad were ejected from their seats and took part of their assigned squad's tasks. Bravo and Charlie moved at a slow pace, matching that of the boots on the ground, as they also simultaneously searched the nearby buildings, scavenging baubles and trinkets from the numerous buildings, with some of the raiders exchanging their newly acquired goods. Sergeant Auclair was the first to speak on the topic, with a stern tone. That had better be food, raider. You know the rules of taking trophies from battle. Not like they were dead, Sarnt. Besides, it was a store, I think. I don't want to hear it, Lockwood. Toss it. Aye, Sarnt, he replied, defeat apparent in his voice, and tossed his trinket alongside the road, as did the others in her purview, not wanting to face verbal reprimand. Bravo and Charlie squads continued on as Delta remained behind, taking cover in the nearby buildings as they awaited the Grizzlies. O'Brien and his squad had continued on toward the gate, but instead of the main road, they opted for the smaller roads that were now available to them once they were further in the outskirts. O'Brien rode passenger in his transport model Puma, the Mark 0, while the others were equipped with the chain gun variant Puma, the Mk1. As they rode, the gunners scanned their surroundings as the force of the wind assaulted them. Luckily, they didn't feel a difference in temperature thanks to their environmental suit they wore beneath their battle dress uniform. It kept the user warm enough in temperate climates and moderate weather, enough for any standard raider to focus solely on their mission at hand. As they slowed their approach through the streets, O'Brien received a transmission from Strega, who rode in a separate vehicle as a passenger. "Sir, didn't you find it odd? Back at that outpost?" she questioned. "I'm just as concerned as you are," he replied, turning his mind to their latest encounter before continuing. "Their encampment seemed fairly unorthodox, given their environment and manpower. You'd think they would take cover in the buildings instead of digging a trench in the center of the road." To O'Brien and to several of the raiders present, if they wanted an outpost to monitor civilian traffic, then there would be no need for a trench, when there existed other forms of deterrence for both humanoid and vehicle alike that were more efficient than whatever the enemy had come up with. As he was dwelling on such items, a voice from Dare was sounded. "Sir, I might have the reason for what we came across." "Oh? Send it over," O'Brien ordered, and as he commanded, information was displayed on a forearm-mounted display. This is... Instead of surprise or shock, he was disappointed. His hidden excitement was tarnished with newfound information, only it wasn't new. At least, not for him. "Athena," he said in a questioning tone. "Care to explain?" The artificial entity made a small groan, like someone who had been caught doing mischievous deeds. Her apparent displeasure had caught the interest of the listening parties as she proceeded to explain. "Ahem. What you are seeing, sir, is a historical document of standard tactics at the turn of the 20th century. It appears to have been studied by a small group of soldiers looking to turn an advantage along an avenue of approach. The Great War, strategies and tactics of the First World War, huh? This is ancient." "Of course," she replied in a triumphant tone. "Trench warfare is outdated by today's standard. I found it fitting, among other things, to supply the enemy with outdated knowledge of tactics and equipment." Over his shared communications, he began to hear snickers and muffled laughter over the realization of the sudden change in tactics from the Sellians. "Well, from what I can tell, there were only a small number who actually put it into practice. We'll be in trouble if they have the slightest bit of defenses. Doesn't matter how old the tactics, siege warfare should be avoided," O'Brien added. Notable nods were made in affirmation to his statement. "How so, if you could be so inclined to explain? I'm not aware of many operations undergone by the raiders. Even I find that information difficult to come by," replied Athena questionably. "Color me surprised," voiced Strega. "Why didn't you break through the classified encryption? Surely you could break it, no problem." "That would be Unprofessional. Besides, I didn't have access to any Raider network even now, replied Athena. Hate to break it to you, my digital friend. Dare was next to add his input. All official missions issued by the ODR are kept at a black site. No matter how advanced you are, you won't be able to find it. It's completely off-grid. The fact that I couldn't even view what should normally be declassified is what frustrates me, voiced their artificial companion. The only thing you'd get close to declassified is whatever they put on the news, added O'Brien. But as I was going to say... O'Brien gave a muddied and vague account of a mission that was emphasized as peak siege warfare. We were sent to a planet to capture an infamous militia group turned pirate. Not something you want happening in a system. It was a combined effort, and by the time we knew it, we found their base of operations. O'Brien's tone lowered, not to be quiet, but reminiscent. HQ wouldn't let the Marines close and wanted something to prove using only the Raiders. Something about disbanding the Raiders since we haven't had a serious op in over 100 years, so the Senate were looking to get rid of the Raider branch. Even the Stellar Fleet was held by Reigns, so we couldn't even bombard them from orbit. In essence, it was a pure Raider operation. I would have assumed that the Raiders would have been involved with plenty of missions since their conception, replied Athena. You'd think so. They usually send us in teams, but the Senate found it better to utilize specialized groups of the more plentiful Marines. We haven't had a serious conflict to deploy us en masse till now. That right, Raiders? Oorah, sounded the rest of his men. He then returned to his conversation with Athena, doing his best to satiate her inquiries, while also not providing away key information that would very likely put him in the brig. We were a small fleet by the time we made it over our target in low orbit. When we dropped, we landed just outside the entrance to the compound, by about 500 meters. It was all the 4th Battalion that dropped, but when we landed, there were no pirates, no gunfire, nothing. It was like a ghost town with how the wind howled. It was eerie, to say the least. Athena didn't present herself in her holographic form, but listened silently to his retelling. Well, we moved forward with the mission, thinking that our ships would provide some form of cover. But we were wrong. The ground was relatively flat, with some old craters from a fight years earlier, but before we knew it, our ships came crashing down, destroyed by a series of well-coordinated size 9 torpedoes. With their shields, a couple would hurt it, but it wouldn't go down. But we saw at least 50 fired from the mountain range right below them, and a shot from a hidden magnetic accelerator built into the compound we were raiding. It took only seconds to wipe out the rest of the fleet. Athena seemed at a loss for words. She tried to look for words of comfort, but none came to her. Instead, she just listened. Then, as we were looking up at the sky, we were hit with machine gun and cannon fire. We had no cover, except for our pods. That was the day that 4th Battalion lost plenty of Raiders. Raptor was at the forefront, with Cobra, Viper, and Raven further behind. With no support from our ships, we were stranded for weeks, with only one mission: take the compound. When you ran out of ammo or rations you took from the nearest fallen teammate, it's what kept us fighting. O'Brien's tone returned to a somber state as he continued. I was barely a corporal when my company took over the compound. We went in with most of the company, but we came out with a squad and a half. Strega, Gray, Dare, and I, along with Auclair from Bravo's squad, are the only original members from that day. That was when they were fresh out of the depot. Want to know what we call it? You have a name for it? Why would you want to memorialize the day when nearly all of your battalion perished? The blood trial is what we call it, revealed O'Brien, leaving Athena momentarily stunned. I do find that name quite distasteful. For what reason did you call it that? Well, aside from everyone who died, have you ever waded ankle-deep in pools of blood from some of your closest friends? From a distance, you would have thought there was a small pond, and the smell of iron lingered on us for days. But because the man leading the pirates was too high profile, we couldn't leave before taking him out. His death is the only thing that saved us from disbanding the Raider Corps. This was when you were a corporal? She inquired. I enlisted before I commissioned as an officer, you know, replied O'Brien, his tone much more joyous than previously. You said, There was at least a squad and a half that made it. What happened to them? She asked. Raptor Company had it the worst, and those who survived either shot themselves or got out, then shot themselves. The other companies got off easier than we did in terms of casualties, but most of us survived to give the Senate reassurance that they could rely on us, he replied, almost indifferently. That's... Athena began, but was interjected by O'Brien. I know, not many people have to face something like that, but holding your best friend's head after a cannon blew him apart. Well, some people can't get that out of their heads. So the only way to escape it, he said, placing his hands to his head, mimicking a handgun, and slamming his thumb down like a cocked hammer going off, is to end it. The raiders who had previously engaged in small conversation were now silent, listening in through the squad-specific comms. Why then? She asked, her tone directed at most of the named survivors. He sounded, beckoning Athena to continue. Why then do you still continue this line of work? As she asked her question, the pumas came to a halt before a large gate, with the walls extending to his left and right until they curved out of his view. O'Brien, Strega, Gray, and Dare then disembarked from their seats, convening together in the center of the pumas that were placed into a circular formation with enough room to not all be made collateral from a well-fired explosive. The gunners maintained their vigilance by aiming their turret outwards of the circle, and the low hum of the engines could still be heard. We do it because someone has to. Someone has to teach the new blood how to get the job done, no matter how bad it gets. Who better than the raiders who survived the blood trial? O'Brien took his suppressed rifle, keeping it slung across his chest and his right hand around the grip in a relaxed motion, as his nearby teammates did similar actions. But that's enough of our earlier days. Let's find a way through this wall before the armor gets here. Of course, sir, replied the AI. Good. Puma teams, scout the area for likely access points and defenses. When you're done, regroup with the main force, ordered O'Brien. Yes, sir. They sounded off, breaking into teams of as their team, when O'Brien turned to speak with the transport-only variant. Head back and regroup with Bravo and Charlie. They'll need the extra supplies, he ordered, grabbing only one item of each that could aid in their infiltration, breaching charges and a forceful electronic access pad, which he handed to Strega. Sir, I already have one, she replied, revealing a worn and personalized FEA pad. It's a backup if yours falls through. Which it won't. Regardless of her stance, he tossed her the extra pad, cutting her off mid-sentence, which she placed in an empty pouch on her thigh. Aye, sir. Their transport had already left, leaving the Four and Athena to search their area for access. They had noticed earlier of a rail system that led from the isolated town to the wall, but instead of being at ground level, it stayed suspended with the height too high for Theme to reach, without grapples or aerial assistance. I shall perform a short radial scan of the area, suggested Athena. Go for it. To which O'Brien replied as he and his fire team actively searched for alternate routes. A high-pitched ping was sounded from his helmet as the scan was performed. There was no difference to his visor as it was done, thinking that he would receive some sort of visual feedback in addition to the ping. Around them were buildings that rose to the mid-height of the wall, removing the option of trying to rappel across the roof to the wall. However, as they moved towards the wall searching the buildings for any useful information, a notification was made by Athena, halting them in their steps. I think I may have found a likely candidate. I have marked the location on your HUDs. I couldn't pinpoint the location, so we'll have to look for it when we get there. All right, you heard her. Let's move.